Greetings, comrades. My name is Gigantles, and if any snowflake radtrad gets triggered by me saying the word comrade outside of a communist or socialist setting, then that's on them. I know it sounds like a very weird way to start off a video, but the last video I made about the SSPX, talking about them now going into open schism, there was literally a guy in the comments who called me a communist simply because I used the word comrade. Too bad for him. Anyway, so in this video, as you can see, it's going to be a continuation of the video that I've made earlier, which explained 24 reasons or 24 ways we know the SSPX are in schism. There are a couple of things I have to say before I begin this video. So firstly, when I say 24 ways we know they're in schism, I don't mean that every single thing in this video that I will say, or in the last video, or any future videos with similar titles, is 24 reasons we know they're in schism. Rather, I use the metaphor of wanting to find a way through a forest from point A to point B, and there are multiple pathways through the forest. And you could consider each of those pathways a reason or line of reasoning as to how we know the SSPX are in schism. What I'm doing in this research is uncovering every single stone that you would be using to line the paths that you would then use to make your way through the forest along those pathways. The more of these videos I do and the more ways that I give, you will begin to construct lines of reasoning from multiple ways that I've given, and that's something I do want to do with my investigation on the SSPX, and this ties into the other thing that I wanted to talk about. My investigation is still ongoing, and it's still many months away from being finished. The problem is that with the SSPX saying that they're going to illicitly consecrate bishops on July the 1st, I believe it is, it's significantly advanced my rate of research so that I can get together a coherent response to the inevitable SSPX defenders and their apologists trying to argue that what they're doing is valid and licit and so on. So if this seems a bit rushed or disorganized, that's why it is, because when I started doing this research, I was just initially, and you can see this in the first video on the series that I made. I'm just going to say it anyway because it's been a while since that video. This series started out as me wanting to give the 4 reasons that I knew the SSPX were in schism, and I quoted from what the Pope said specifically. But before I had even finished writing that post, I started finding other ways we knew they were in schism, so it was more than just what specific popes had said. I then started finding specific lines of reasoning and what the cardinals had said, and specific counter-arguments to what the SSPX were used to justify themselves. And so that one post with 4 ways we know they're in schism became 24 reasons across 6 posts. I said at the end of that, on the final post, that if there were more ways we know they're in schism, I would provide them in later posts. And almost immediately, I started finding new ways. And I said, okay, you know what? I'll come back to it another time. Fast forward several months, I decided I wanted to do an updated series, continuing with another 24 reasons. So I started doing my research, and I found out that there were hundreds of ways to demonstrate it. And not just like ways of reasoning, but simply because I could find hundreds of quotes from popes, theologians, documents, what the SSPX themselves have said, and I said, okay, you know what, I'm going to have to compile everything before I start putting it down in Facebook posts so I don't confuse myself. And that's how I started this whole investigation. Or rather, the investigation proper. The problem is, in my research, I started very quickly finding out that it wasn't hundreds of ways we know the SSPX are in schism, it was thousands. And I stopped counting somewhere around the 3,000 mark, because it was just taking too much time to put together the investigation the way I wanted to, or format it, this early in my research. So I promise you, I will start reading from the video shortly. But as you can see from the screen right now, I have reason 25 here, so a specific statement, followed by a quote, and then the reference, and then finally a link. And then, but after that is a paragraph of explanation. That was how I started compiling and performing my research. And I think after maybe several hundred of these points I started coming up with, I realized that it was taking too long and that I had way too many tabs open on my computer because of all the rabbit holes I kept going down. So I scrapped me putting in this paragraph of analysis, and I said I'll do it later. I'll just focus on compiling stuff. And so I continued. And then sometime around the 3,000 mark, I realized it was still taking a while because I was coming up with individual statements. So I said that I was going to go on these websites and video transcripts and stuff that I was looking at, and I would basically copy and paste entire portions of them and put them in my Word documents. And then I'll come back to that at a later point, strip out everything unnecessary, and then from that I will pull out individual points and then provide explanations and so on. So it was just me compiling evidence rather than me compiling a single piece of evidence, giving it a title, and then providing some analysis of it, especially if I was going to be repeating myself a lot of the time. Because what I want from this investigation is for me to be able to say a single point as to how we know the SSPX are in schism, and then provide multiple quotations or references demonstrating what I'm saying. So if I say a specific pope said the SSPX were in schism, I'll be able to provide a dozen references. If I wanted to say the SSPX are violating divine law, I could provide a dozen references, rather than me just saying the SSPX reject divine law in 12 different ways. Or literally the statement, the SSPX reject divine law, and then rewording that 12 different times. This is a work in progress, and especially with my research this far back, which it's a bit difficult to remember it given how much I've read since then. But if this seems a bit erratic or changes topic very quickly, that's why. It's because I'm trying to cover a range of topics relating to the SSPX, so you can get a better understanding of how we know they're in schism, even if they haven't illicitly consecrated bishops on yet, as they will on July the 1st, because they were already recognized as schismatic as far back as the 70s. So the whole point of this video is, and I know this introduction's been going on quite a bit, but please understand that I'm not going to do this massive introduction in every one of my videos. I'm just doing this now because I'm being forced to rush this somewhat, with the SSPX's promise to illicitly consecrate bishops on July the 1st. My third and fourth videos that I have planned for this, I won't have such a long introduction, so don't worry about that. Point is, for this video and other videos in the series, I'm going to read out basically what I've written, maybe add some extra comments based upon what my further research has demonstrated, and yeah, so I'm just going to get into it. 25. The Catechism defines lack of submission to the Pope and not being in communion with the Church as schismatic. Actually, how do we reference this? Is it Catechism point 2089? Is it CCC 2089? I'm not sure how I can reference that, but just point 2089. Incredulity is the neglect of revealed truth or the willful refusal to assent to it. Heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, or it is likewise an obstinate doubt concerning the same. Apostasy is the total repudiation of the Christian faith. Schism is a refusal of submission to the Roman Pontiff or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. This is a pretty clear definition of schism here. We know the SSPX doesn't submit to the Pope. The Pope is the Pope. To be Catholic is to submit to him through obedience. The SSPX will usually try to say they're not in schism because they pray for the Pope, but that's not enough. If you obey a father, you obey him as a father, with all the tasks that requires. If you work in a job, you submit to your boss and you do your job. With the Pope, we have to submit to him where due according to his authority. If he ratifies an ecumenical council, we are not in a position to disagree with it. If he issues a change to the liturgy of his own right, we are not in a position to deem it heretical or an offense to God. It's as simple as that, which makes determining the SSPX being in schism a simple conclusion. And I know the SSPX do a lot of writings about what true obedience means, but they're really just trying to make an excuse to reject, to pick and choose what parts of what the popes teach to reject. And this is something, it's actually quite ironic, because I'm reading copies of the Angelus in my research, and the SSPX writes a huge amount about how we should respect authority and we should listen to our fathers, whether they be our literal fathers or spiritual fathers. But they don't take their own advice. They just pick and choose. And when you see what some of the arguments that they use against submitting to the Pope are, which include accusing him of heresy, and in some cases literally leading the church to ruin, you can't say stuff like that without having a schismatic mindset. 26. The original Catholic Encyclopedia includes undermining the authority of the Pope as a sign of schism. Schism, therefore, is usually mixed, in which case, considered from a moral standpoint, its perversity is chiefly due to the heresy which forms part of it. In its other aspect, and as being purely schism, it is contrary to charity and obedience. To the former, because it severs the ties of fraternal charity; to the latter, because the schismatic rebels against the divinely constituted hierarchy. However, not every disobedience is a schism. In order to possess this character, it must include, besides the transgression of the commands of superiors, denial of their divine right to command. And that's from the original Catholic Encyclopedia in 1912. More than just their continuous disobedience to the Pope, the SSPX are known for being a breeding ground of conspiracies with sedevacantist conclusions. Remember, Lefebvre was the one who said Rome is in apostasy. That was a clear sign he rejected the magisterium, believing they weren't even Christian due to their embracement of heresy. He repeated further accusations of heresy and slander to the point that the Vatican called him out on it and demanded he issue a public retraction. And if what I recently watched was true, the many sedevacantist clergymen today were tolerated and even encouraged by Lefebvre. As for the rest of the SSPX beyond Lefebvre, they knowingly endorsed in beliefs that undermine the Pope. Sure, they claim to pray for him, but they also try to claim that the divine right of the Pope to choose bishops didn't apply to those ordained by Lefebvre, that the Pope apparently cannot dictate the form of the Latin liturgy, despite all other heads of other liturgies being able to do that with permission from the Pope, and some go so far as to accuse a vast secret network of corruption in the Church to conceal secrets written by mystics, such as Melanie from La Salette and Venerable Sister Lucia from Fatima. The scale of such a conspiracy points to sedevacantism. It would be impossible for multiple popes to not know what was going on and support it. So whilst the SSPX may claim that they believe the post-Vatican II popes are valid, their beliefs do not align with that farce. Just the sheer number of conspiracies I've personally seen in the SSPX in my research, you cannot take them credibly. You just can't. And if what I remember is correct, when I was reading the SSPX copy, or the SSPX issue of the Angelus, I think from 2017, they didn't yet endorse in the Imposter Lucia conspiracy. That only came later, and I think it's because they really hated Pope Francis, despite him granting them 1.5 sacraments, or I guess 1 sacrament conditionally or 1 sacrament unconditionally, well, the faculties for them at least. But they hadn't yet started financing, I think, the Sister Lucia conspiracy, the Imposter Lucia conspiracy, and they actually wrote in defense of Sister Lucia, claiming that the Third Secret of Fatima had been released in its entirety. So, they're willing to go back on things that they had initially held. I don't know how long they've held the belief that the Third Secret was revealed in its entirety. At least 17 years, I think, since the Vatican revealed the Third Secret in the year 2000. So they're willing to go back on stuff that they had already accepted with certainty, if it means that they can accuse the papacy of just further corruption. 27. Lefebvre acted just like Luther and Calvin in condemning the Catholic Church, save for his remnant. It is proved by all the historical monuments, and especially by the writings of Luther and Calvin, that, prior to the anathema pronounced against them at the Council of Trent, the leaders of the Reformation had proclaimed and repeated that the Roman Church was the Babylon of the Apocalypse, the synagogue of Satan, the society of Antichrist, that they must therefore depart from it, and that they did so in order to re-enter the way of salvation. And in this they suited the action to the word. Thus the schism was well consummated by them before it was solemnly established by the authority, which they rejected and transformed by that authority into a just penal sanction. Before I continue, you will notice that as I give these points, you will see me referencing the same document quite a bit, and that's because when I was doing my research, I would literally take an article, or as you can see, it's still the same entry on schism in the original Catholic Encyclopedia, and I would systematically take it apart to get individual statements from it. And you'll see this quite often when I'm looking at letters from Lefebvre and to the Pope and vice versa later on. So it's not me trying to stretch out the list of ways we know the SSPX are in schism. It's me taking a very detailed look at what the individual lines of reasoning or individual points being made by these writers, and then applying them to the SSPX. Remember that quote from Lefebvre where he claims, "I am not of that Catholic religion, I do not accept that new religion, it is a liberal modernist religion"? Or that other one, "A new church, which they call themselves the Conciliar Church"? Lefebvre is doing exactly what the Protestant fathers did when rejecting the authority of Rome. He claims, "Rome has lost her faith, my dear friends, Rome is in apostasy." Pope St. Paul VI would definitely make him eat his words in 1976 by meeting him in person and confronting him on such accusations. But it is from this language that we see Lefebvre considers the SSPX and the Catholic Church to be two distinct entities. The Catholic Church, which he slanders as conciliar and liberal and modernist, and the SSPX. Okay, I've just realized I didn't put I think I closed that bracket off, but as I said, this is still early draft. They are headed by the Pope and the Magisterium, who are in apostasy versus his authority over the SSPX. What more could one want as proof his schism from reading this? His actions? He never retracted his claims, nor did he apologize for his poor choice of words. The SSPX to this day discourage Catholics from attending the Novus Ordo liturgy approved by the Magisterium that their founder had said had apostatized. It is an offense, evil, and heretical. They had the same attitude he did, and that is the attitude which prompted the Vatican to withdraw their support of and then suppress the SSPX, long before they were formally declared in schism and excommunicated in 1988. Some of these references, like the one where Rome is in apostasy and I am not of that Catholic religion, are in my first video my first 24 ways we know the SSPX are in schism. So if you want to see that, go watch that video if you haven't already. Point 28. The SSPX undermines the ecclesial and hierarchical unity of the Church through attacking the papacy. Okay, I keep jumping too much when trying to scroll and stuff, sorry. As schism in its definition and full sense is the practical denial of ecclesiastical unity, the explanation of the former requires a clear definition of the latter, and to prove the necessity of the latter is to establish the intrinsic malice of the former. Indeed, the texts of Scripture and tradition show these aspects of the same truth to be so closely united that passage from one to the other is constant and spontaneous. When Christ built on Peter as on an unshakable foundation, the indestructible edifice of his church, he thereby indicated its essential unity and especially the hierarchical unity. What many SSPX defenders and radtrads like to do is undermine the Pope, because this then allows them to pick and choose what he says for them to believe in. But in doing so, they undermine the authority and unity of the Church. What happens when a radtrad becomes a clergyman and professes their errors as truth to their parish? Take a look at the laicized priest James Altman, who now promotes sedevacantist theology. Okay, I clearly put that space in the wrong place. What if they become a bishop? Take a look at the dismissed Bishop Strickland, who argues that a bishop's authority comes from the Church, which is in direct contradiction to the Church teaching that a bishop's authority comes from the Pope. And if they become an archbishop, we have cases like the self-excommunicated Vigano, who proves that the schismatic mindset can reach the highest level achieved in the Church through personal effort alone. Since cardinals are chosen by the Pope. What does this have to do with the SSPX? Well, what has been the impact of their words and actions? We now have a community of people and illicitly ordained clergymen that subscribe to beliefs and conspiracies that allow them to completely ignore the Pope. And if they ignore the Pope, they can ignore the rest of the bishops and clergymen in the Church. Calling the Pope or anyone else a heretic would have had the Inquisition on your doorstep hundreds of years ago, but there is no such accountability for one words now. This isn't right. You can't slander the Pope in the same way that the Protestants have done for hundreds of years, yet expect to be considered Catholic. How you treat God's servants on earth is how you treat God, their master. Yeah, I think that'll make it a bit easier for scrolling. I think I wrote this part of my research was quite early. It was probably, I think, relatively soon after both Altman technically excommunicated himself, and then later on when Vigano excommunicated himself and received a formal notification from Pope Francis at the time, that he had excommunicated himself. But I remember back in the days when people were comparing Father James Martin and James Altman and saying one was unjustly removed from office and the other should be removed from office because of the confusion he's promoting. And then I said, similar to when Pavone was removed from office, and I think it took a month for the reasons why he was removed from office to be revealed in everything in their entirety. And even then, I was saying, yeah, I knew I should have waited. I knew it was right to wait and see why he was removed from office. And then when Altman was removed from office, I said, I'm sure there's a good reason. And I think it took a year before he started revealing his sedevacantist colours. So, as for Bishop Strickland, he's still a bishop as far as I know. He hasn't been laicized or anything, but he has said once that the authority bishops have comes from the Church rather than the Pope, which is incredibly problematic and sounds very Protestant. And then for Vigano, he had already been publishing problematic documents for years before he had made that final step. And then it turned out after he had formally gone into schism, so again, not that he only went in schism at that point, but after he had formally gone into schism and recognized as being excommunicated, he then went and got, I think, conditionally reconsecrated as a bishop by the now deceased expelled SSPX bishop known as Williamson. And it gets even weirder because the SSPX have said Vigano is sedevacantist in his words, and even though Vigano has already expressed his support of the SSPX illicitly consecrating bishops, so they have a bit of a weird relationship, those two. And even I remember when I was talking to someone when we were discussing, even I think in January before it came out that they would illicitly consecrate bishops, and we were discussing, they would consecrate someone soon. We were discussing what potential bishops they could rely on for them to illicitly consecrate a new line of bishops in the SSPX, if anything happened to either Fele or Alfonso, who were the two remaining bishops of the SSPX. And we concluded that Vigano would probably not be trusted because of his extremely problematic statements, and if the SSPX genuinely wanted to continue presenting themselves as being in communion with Rome, even though they aren't, they wouldn't. It would seem a bit too far for them to rely on effectively a sedevacantist bishop for them for their illicit consecration, to perform their illicit consecrations and then claim that they actually are illicit and valid and licit. But the SSPX will only be able to continue with this illusion of being valid and licitly consecrated even against the will of the Pope. And I'm sure that at some point in the future they will just rely on sedevacantist bishops for their survival. But that's a lot of waffling on about that one point, so I should probably just move on. Point 29. The SSPX illicitly ordained priests and deacons for an excommunicated and schismatic Ukrainian Catholic Church sect. On the 22nd of November 2006, Bishop Richard Williamson, who was then a member of the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, ordained 2 priests and 7 deacons in Warsaw, Poland, for the SSJK in violation of Canon 1015.2, I'm not sure how to read that, and of Canons 1021 and 1331.2 of the Code of Canon Law, and the corresponding canons of the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches. Canon 1021 regards dismissorial letters not being licit if sent to those in another rite. Canon 1331.2 regards the excommunicated being barred from the sacraments, and Canon 1015 says this. Point 2. If not impeded by a just cause, the proper bishop is to ordain his own subjects personally, without an apostolic indult. However, he cannot ordain illicitly the subject of an Eastern Rite. So no Latin Rite bishop can ordain a priest from the Eastern Rite without permission of the specific eparch. And for those who aren't aware, an eparch is the Eastern Catholic name for a bishop. So, kind of like how we have bishops and dioceses, the Eastern Catholic churches have eparchs and eparchies, if that's how you pronounce them. This is reminiscent of how Lefebvre illicitly consecrated 4 bishops against the will of the Pope. Now Fele, one of those 4 bishops, illicitly... Okay, I think I messed that up, hold on. There you go. Now Williamson, one of those 4 bishops, illicitly ordained 2 priests and 7 deacons without permission from either the Pope or the specific eparch. It was for this reason that Basil and his fellow schismatics were excommunicated, and there were already excommunications binding on Fele. See, this is what I mean about this as being in the first draft. I get some of the names wrong sometimes, sorry. It was for this reason that Basil and his fellow schismatics were excommunicated, and there were already excommunications binding on Williamson. Clearly they not only considered themselves above canon law and the magisterial authority that defined it, but also above the authority of the eparchs in the Eastern Rites. Okay, why did I put this here? See, this is what I mean about this being in an early draft. Sometimes it gets weird. I promise these things clear up later on, but I'm just gonna put this down here somewhere. Maybe because I'm referencing something else. But the point is that back in 2006, so this was before both Williamson was removed from office and expelled from the SSPX, and also before the SSPX had their canonical excommunications lifted, they were already causing trouble for the Eastern Catholic churches. And the SSJK is, I can't remember what it specifically stands for, but it's basically a society based upon Saint Josaphat, who was a convert from the Eastern Orthodox, I believe, to the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and then eventually he was martyred. But basically, there were these priests who were ignoring the will of their bishop and their eparch, and he excommunicated them, but then they appealed to Rome, and the Rome lifted the excommunication. And then, upon this action, the eparch excommunicated them again for being illicitly consecrated, illicitly ordained to the priesthood, and the deacons as well. This goes to show that the SSPX, it's not only a matter of them rejecting the authority of the Pope in the Latin Rite, they're also rejecting the authority of the Eastern Catholic eparchs and the Pope, well, the Eastern Catholic eparchs and then Eastern Catholic Rite, and also the Pope as the head of the entire Catholic Church. So they're spreading their corruption not only across the West through the Latin Rite, but also into the East through a schismatic priestly body. I'm not sure if I can necessarily say it's comparable to the SSPX, even if they don't have their own eparchs in it, but a schismatic group of priests in the Eastern Catholic Church, Eastern Catholic churches. Point 30. The Dicastery for Legislative Texts says that the SSPX are in schism. Unfortunately, the Schismatic Act that gave rise to the motu proprio and the decree has done nothing other than to bring to completion, in a particularly visible and unequivocal manner, with a very serious formal act of disobedience to the Roman Pontiff, a process of distancing from the communio hierarchica, if that's how you pronounce it. Until there are changes that lead to the re-establishment of this necessary communio, the entire Lefebvrean movement is to be considered schismatic, there being a formal declaration in this regard from the supreme authority. Dicastery for Legislative Texts, Explanatory Note 5, on the excommunication for schism incurred by the adherents of the movement of Bishop Marcel Lefebvre. Sometimes the Pope can make confusing statements. Many know this from personal experience with Pope Francis. For those who believe there is genuine confusion in the matter, that is where the Dicastery for Legislative Texts come in. They are authoritative interpreters of papal encyclicals and documents. And when the decree of excommunication was published, the Dicastery later stepped in to offer a clear explanation. Much to the dismay of SSPX defenders, they provided a detailed analysis of the popes that explained not only why the excommunication was both valid and illicit, but also that it had been the culmination of the SSPX distancing itself from Rome for a while now. So, Pope St. John Paul II's words weren't confused or misread, they were clear in their meaning against Lefebvre. And unlike the SSPX and their army of armchair theologians, the Dicastery actually has authority in their interpretation. How much copium does one have to then claim that the authoritative interpreter of the Pope's words is also incorrect? Clearly someone who knows they're in the wrong, leaving them grasping at straws. Also, if you've noticed the text changing throughout me reading that, it's because I can only tolerate so many spelling mistakes when I'm reading them out, and I've been correcting this thing as I read it. But the point is that the Dicastery for Legislative Texts has explained the excommunication of the SSPX after some confusion arose about it, and they said that what the Pope had done wasn't just something done out the blue. He had given them plenty of warning, and that the SSPX had already been schismatic for a while, but they went the further extra step to disobeying divine law itself when it came to the illicit consecration of bishops against the will of the Pope, and in violation of his divine right to choose them. So, this wasn't a matter about being confused by Pope St. John Paul II's words. Point 31. The Dicastery for Legislative Texts says that the illicit ordinations were the final straw for the Church's official recognition of the SSPX's schism. From the motu proprio Ecclesia Dei of July 2nd, 1988, and from the decree Dominus Marcellus Lefebvre of the Congregation for Bishops of July 1st, 1988, it appears first of all that the schism of Archbishop Lefebvre was declared in immediate relation to the episcopal ordinations performed on June 30th, 1988, without pontifical mandate. However, it also clearly appears from the aforementioned documents that this very grave act of disobedience constituted the consummation of a progressive global situation of a schismatic nature. Continuing from the same document, the Dicastery makes clear that the SSPX had been schismatic for a period of time, not just in one area, but across the whole society as a whole. Yeah, I really have to work on this draft of my analysis and stuff, sorry guys. Having read the documents of Pope St. Paul VI and Blessed Pope John Paul II, again, it's a draft, it's an early draft. Having read the documents of Pope St. Paul VI and Blessed Pope John Paul I, I understand what they mean. The popes openly referred to the SSPX as being literally schismatic, denying the authority of the Pope, which is theologically schismatic, and going so far as to accuse the Pope of heresy. The illicit ordinations were just a final event that led to Pope St. John Paul II finally formally excommunicating Lefebvre and his illicit bishops, proving to the world that the society is officially schismatic. I'm definitely going to have to reword this and then clarify some stuff. Lefebvre had already been illicitly ordaining priests since the 70s, but you don't need permission from the Pope to do that, even if he did say he's revoked your faculties for that. But the the illicit consecration of bishops, which requires not just faculties, but a pontifical mandate, I believe it is specifically. I can't remember if it's a pontifical mandate or an apostolic mandate, but the mandate required for that, doing that against his will, means you are in open schism, no matter how much you may try to justify it. And as the series goes on, you will see me look at a lot of documents by Pope Saint Paul VI when he was trying to deal with Lefebvre's schism in his day, and then a lot of documents by Pope Saint John Paul II and the then Cardinal Ratzinger. As for what Blessed Pope John Paul I said, he didn't write much in his 33 days in office, but one of the things he did say was he described the situation with the SSPX as being a tear in the unity of being a tear in the fabric of the unity of the Church, which is a very clear language regarding the SSPX being a schism. So it wasn't much, but it was enough. And now that I think about it, they said that they were illicitly consecrating a new round of bishops on July the 1st, right? Because I just saw the reference to July the 1st in the Dicastery for Legislative Texts words here, and I'm wondering if maybe that was chosen on purpose. But you can tell the SSPX are quite desperate to be illicitly consecrating bishops now, because if they wanted to have some sort of like special anniversary event for that, then they would have waited until 2028, which would have been the 40th anniversary of the illicit consecrations, I believe. But the fact that they're doing it now, it shows how desperate they are, because they've only got 2 bishops. They can't guarantee that a set of vacancies bishop out there would help them, or just one that would align with their beliefs, or rather their delusions that you can be schismatic in theology, but not schismatic because you pray for the Pope. And so they're rushing it now. Point 32. The Dicastery for Bishops has said that the SSPX were in schism. In fact, number 4, the motu proprio, explains what the doctrinal root of the Schismatic Act was, and number 5c warns that a formal adherence to the schism, meaning the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, would entail the excommunication established by the universal law of the Church. The decree of the Congregation for Bishops also makes explicit reference to the schismatic nature of the aforementioned episcopal ordinations and recalls a very serious penalty of excommunication that adherence to the schism of Archbishop Lefebvre would entail. Formerly known as the Congregation of Bishops, the Dicastery for Bishops oversees the selection of most new bishops with the approval of the papacy, as well as ensuring a bishop meets with the Pope every 5 years to deliver a report on the state of the diocese. If Lefebvre had followed the conditions given to him by the Pope, then once he chose his successor, he would have to tell the Dicastery, then congregation, of his choice. The Pope would then give his seal of approval, and Lefebvre would have been fine. But because Lefebvre had lacked the faith in God that he would keep him alive long enough to choose a successor, he cut immediately to consecrating his successors without any process of approval, and it is that which led to his and his bishops' excommunications. That's something I'll be saying a lot of when it comes to my research on the SSPX. Lefebvre talks a lot about how he felt called by God in setting up the SSPX and helping preserve it, but he definitely lacked faith in God if he thought that, well, firstly, God was apparently supporting him, but he couldn't wait long enough for formal procedures and to be followed in the church so that he could then have a bishop consecrated to succeed him and continue the survival of the SSPX. So this faith in God seems very conditional, to the point that he would act in defiance of the Pope, and how that would reflect on his well, as I said before, you respect the servant, you respect the master. So he's being very inconsistent in claiming to follow God and follow the Pope, but then reject the Pope and basically slander him, and then expect that God will still somehow side with him, or that he's still somehow on God's side despite that disrespect. Point 33. There is never a need to ordain bishops against the will of the Pope. As for the state of necessity in which Archbishop Lefebvre thought he found himself, it must be kept in mind that such a state must objectively occur, and that there is never a need to ordain bishops against the will of the Roman Pontiff, head of the College of Bishops. This, in fact, would mean the possibility of serving the Church by attacking its unity in a manner connected to the very foundations of its unity. I referred to this quote in an earlier post, but here it is in its fuller context. I'm not sure because I was picking and choosing when it came to specific points for this video, so maybe you find the shortened version of this quote in an earlier post in the previous video, or not. If you don't worry, it will be revealed eventually. The Pope has the divine right to choose bishops, and the ordination of bishops is a matter of divine law. This means that there can never be a state of necessity or circumstance where the rules in the Church are broken to choose and elect a valid and licit bishop. The dicastery speaks with complete certainty over this. The difference between a priest and a bishop in the Church is substantial. Protestants may elect or declare themselves priests and ministers, but in the Church, priests are merely helpers of bishops to better manage the spiritual needs of the people in a diocese. Bishops are where the real power and authority lies. So Lefebvre illicitly consecrating bishops is a dangerous move that would serve to damage the Church from within, especially given the nature of apostolic succession. The apostles were the first bishops, after all. Point 34. Lefebvre and his followers erroneously believed they were following an authority above that of the Pope, hence a lack of obedience to him. As stated in Motu Proprio, number 5c, Latae Sententiae, that's how you pronounce it, excommunication for schism concerns those who formally adhere to the said schismatic movement. Although the question regarding the exact scope of the notion of formal adherence to the schism should be referred to the competent congregation for the doctrine of the faith, it seems to this pontifical council that such adherence must imply two complementary elements. A, one of an internal nature, consisting in freely and consciously sharing the substance of the schism, that is, in opting in such a way for the followers of Lefebvre that this option is placed above obedience to the Pope. At the root of this attitude, there will usually be positions contrary to the magisterium of the Church. And then point B will be continued later on. This is something that the defenders of the SSPX will either deny happens or try to twist canon law and divine law around in order to support. In reality, this is not something which can be done without a gross misrepresentation of either of them. The SSPX do not respect the authority of the Pope. They do not recognize or acknowledge it. If they did, they would submit to him in their words and actions as the head of the Church on earth. There is no circumstance under which a bishop can be chosen and consecrated against the will of the Pope, to whom belongs a divine right. Embracing contradictory beliefs to what the Pope and the Church professes, pridefully claiming it is the Church, save for their remnant who is in error, is not a sign of respect nor submission to the Pope either. Remember how the Pharisees made a big show about the outward presentation of their faith, but neglected the substance of it? That's the SSPX here. They're good at pretending, but their twisted theology and private comments make clear that they are fermenting in their schism. You will not believe the things that I've seen. Even Lefebvre and some of the early priests and bishops of the SSPX have said about the Pope and about the Church. You can't read that and think that they are in communion with the Church. They would not be saying things so unflattering and slanderous about the Church, or the Pope, or the bishops, or even just the people who attend a Novus Ordo liturgy, if they genuinely were in communion with us. Because that would be like spitting on your brother and then claiming that you still love him and are in a family with him. You only have that level of disrespect for someone you do not consider your brother, because otherwise you would either have a very twisted concept of what it means to be a brother and respect due to that, or you're just lying and you don't consider them to be your brother. Point 35. Whilst difficult to determine the depth and scale of investigation, it is possible for members of the laity to be schismatic when joining the SSPX. In the case of the other faithful, however, it is obvious that occasional participation in liturgical acts or activities of the Lefebvrean movement without adopting the movement's attitude of doctrinal and disciplinary disunity is not sufficient to constitute formal membership in the movement. In pastoral practice, it may be more difficult to assess a situation. It is necessary to take into account, above all, the individual's intention and the translation of this interior disposition into action. The various situations must therefore be assessed on a case-by-case basis in the competent bodies of the external and internal forums. This is an important text right here. The laity are not necessarily adhering to Lefebvre's schism by attending the SSPX services, but that doesn't mean there aren't some laity who do adhere to it. You can see this in those who not only try to defend the SSPX, but also attack the Novus Ordo and the post-Vatican II Church. They are usually the most vocal of their stance too, which means that we often find them quite easily. They speak without concern for or regard for the consequences of their statements, but whilst we can call them schismatic, formally labeling them as being in schism will require a thorough ecclesial investigation. Unlike the SSPX, we cannot sink to the level of making judgments without following the appropriate canonical procedures in place. We are a civilized institution, the Catholic Church, not a Protestant mob. So firstly, something I just want to say right off the bat. If you see me refer to Protestant or Protestantism throughout this in a way that it seems like I'm inferring the SSPX are Protestants, I have received some criticism in my when I've referred to them in that way in the past, because some people said that this might lead to some confusion, since you think of the word Protestant and you immediately think of the reformers of the 16th century. So, as I said, this is my first draft. I may reword some of my statements here to just call them protesters rather than Protestants. But the reason why I included this is because one of the things the SSPX will try to claim that as evidence that they're not in schism is the case of, I think it's the Hawaii Six. And that is because sometime, I can't remember when, I think it was in the 90s, 6 lay people went to an SSPX chapel and their bishop excommunicated them. And after investigation by the Vatican, the excommunication was lifted. But as it says in this document, just because someone attends the SSPX service doesn't mean that they are necessarily in schism. You need to have a thorough investigation before you can make that judgment. The bishop who excommunicated them seemed to have acted too quickly, but this document does allow for the fact that it is possible for people who attend the SSPX services to be recognized as being in schism after a thorough investigation has been made. Although you can say that there are definitely those who are schismatic at the very least, since schism is a formal thing, is a formal recognition of schismatic behavior. And although there hasn't been an investigation of every single person that I've seen promoting schismatic ideas and they attend the SSPX liturgy, that doesn't mean we can't recognize them as having a schismatic mindset nonetheless. Point 36. Cardinal Gerard Muller says that the SSPX are in schism. As you know, Pope Francis has many a time manifested his benevolence towards your priestly society, granting, in particular, to all priest members of the faculty of confessing the faithfully valid and by authorizing local ordinaries to grant licenses for the celebration of the marriages of the faithful who follow the pastoral activity in your society. Furthermore, discussions are continuing concerning questions relative to the full re-establishment of the communion of your society with the Catholic Church. Cardinal Muller, I hope that's how you pronounce it, was the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith from 2012 to 2017, which is basically the renamed Office of Inquisition where heresy and schism was dealt with. In the letter to the Pope, it should be Fele, sorry. In the letter to Fele, not only does he specifically say that the SSPX are not in full communion and need to work towards it, but that there are 3 conditions they must meet before their schism can be considered over. The first is adopting the 1998 Oath of Fidelity, the second being the acceptance of Vatican II and everything after it, and the third is an acceptance of both the validity and legitimacy of the Latin Rite sacraments after Vatican II. These tie in nicely with my earlier points. I don't think I included that well, obviously it didn't include it in this point, but I'm sure I included those 3 points in the original list. Whether or not I put them in this one, I can't remember, but the points remain relatively the same. When I was doing my research on the letters of exchange just before, when Cardinal Ratzinger was trying to work with Lefebvre to try and stop him illicitly consecrating bishops in 1988, he called for something similar. And I think in addition to that was a written letter of apology for all the bishops and priests and the Pope that he had slandered by calling them apostates and saying that they were modernists and so on. But essentially, these 3 points are required for the SSPX to return to communion. And I know that the SSPX have I may have to recheck the specific wording of it, but I believe the Vatican asked for the SSPX to do something similar recently, to try and stop them illicitly consecrating bishops on July the 1st, but the SSPX have said no, we won't, so it looks like they're going ahead with it. But the 3 points here, as it says, is to adopt the 1998 Oath of Fidelity, accepting Vatican II and everything after it, and to accept the validity and legitimacy of the sacraments of the Novus Ordo liturgy, because they like to claim that it's blasphemous, it's sacrilegious, and so on. Point 37. The Ecclesia Dei Commission's mission was transferred, not ended. Pope Francis issued a motu proprio on Saturday ending the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei and creating an office within the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith to focus on doctrinal talks with traditionalist groups. After the SSPX went into schism, Pope St. John Paul II established the Ecclesia Dei Commission. Its job involved helping clergy leave the SSPX to find a society or order to join in communion in the Church, to help regulate the celebration of the Latin Mass, and to help the SSPX return to full communion with the Church. Pope Francis dissolved the commission in 2019 as part of his reforms and created an office for it in the dicastery, renamed from Congregation in 2022, of the Doctrine of Faith. Some SSPX apologists will try to claim that the DDF doesn't handle cases of schism, and so this means the SSPX isn't in schism, but this shows poor scholarship on the part of the SSPX. It now does deal with cases of schism, with an office specifically for their schism. So as I said in this point, and you can here read it, the SSPX like to claim that because Ecclesia Dei doesn't exist since 2019, it means that the SSPX aren't in schism, since their matter is being dealt with by another part of the Church. But, as I also said, Just because its mission was transferred doesn't mean it was ended. And we know that they are in schism because there has been plenty of cardinals and theologians who have said since 2019 that the SSPX are in schism, and this has only become even more clear or even more evident ever since the SSPX said that they were going to illicitly consecrate bishops this February. They said it in this February, and then they said they would actually do it in July. I didn't have the advantage that I do now, where you have multiple cardinals and bishops and theologians coming forward and saying the SSPX are in schism, but there were some already who after 2019 were saying this, so they clearly knew that just because Ecclesia Dei had been dissolved didn't mean that its mission had ended, only that its mission had been transferred. Point 38. Cardinal Pell affirmed Pope Benedict XVI believed that they were still in schism. He, Pope Benedict XVI, did not receive back the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X, but only lifted their excommunication. They are still in schism. Cardinal Pell is a controversial character, but I'm not here to talk about that. Instead, I'm going to bring up part of the refutation he made against the heretic Eric Hodgins. He's stating that the SSPX are still in schism in the eyes of Pope Benedict XVI, even after he lifted the excommunications of the then living SSPX bishops in 2009. I've yet to see a document by Pope Benedict XVI saying that the cardinal was wrong, nor have I seen any theologian focus on this as an issue. If anything, Cardinal Pell was praised for his refutation. Okay, so maybe I didn't write this part of my research last year, but the point is that Pope Benedict XVI nowhere said that the SSPX weren't in schism. He may have lifted their canonical excommunication, but he never said that they weren't in schism. And regardless of what Cardinal Pell may believe or do that was controversial, I can't remember specifically what that is now, but you have other people saying that Pope Benedict XVI considered the SSPX as still in schism. So this isn't just a misunderstanding of Pope Benedict XVI and his words. This is what other people that he may have, I can't remember if he made Cardinal Pell cardinal or not, or if that was Pope Francis or whatever, but there were people around Pope Benedict XVI who recognized him saying that the SSPX were in schism, basically confirming what he had written about the SSPX still being in schism. Point 39. The Catechism of Pope St. Pius X places the SSPX outside of the Church. Question 8, I think that is. What is the Catholic Church? Answer. The Catholic Church is the union or congregation of all the baptized who, still living on earth, profess the same faith and the same law of Jesus Christ, participate in the same sacraments, and obey their lawful pastors, particularly the Roman Pontiff. Question 9. State distinctly what is necessary to be a member of the Church. Answer. To be a member of the Church, it is necessary to be baptized, to believe and profess the teaching of Jesus Christ, to participate in the same sacraments, and to acknowledge the Pope and the other lawful pastors of the Church. Question 12. The many societies of persons who are baptized but do not acknowledge the Roman Pontiff as the head do not, then, belong to the Church of Jesus Christ. Answer. No. Those who do not acknowledge the Roman Pontiff as the head do not belong to the Church of Jesus Christ. Question 13. How can the Church of Jesus Christ be distinguished from the numerous societies or sects founded by men and calling themselves Christian? Answer. From the numerous societies or sects founded by men and calling themselves Christian, the Church of Jesus Christ is easily distinguished by 4 marks. She is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Question 14. Why is the Church called one? Answer. The true Church is called one because her children of all ages and places are united together in the same faith, in the same worship, in the same law, and in participation of the same sacraments under the same visible head, the Roman Pontiff. And this is from the Catechism of Pope St. Pius X from 1908. Also, if you hear me say words weirdly, it's because I'm not used to reading from a script, and normally when I do that, my tongue starts stumbling over itself, and also, depending on how long I've been talking, my mouth gets dry and tired. Anyway, I know this is a long one, but it was necessary to specify that A. Catholics have to submit to the Pope, B. Not everyone who claims to be Christian are actually Christians, and C. The way to tell these fake Christians from real ones are to see who follows the Pope. This very clearly places the SSPX outside the Catholic Church. They only listen to the Pope when it conveniences them, and they've been ignoring the Pope for decades since the days of their founder. This conditional or selective obedience shows that they consider themselves as their own supreme authority in the Church, not the Pope. And to justify this obviously schismatic mindset, they come up with convoluted conspiracies of some mystical corruption and remnant that they are a part of. The fact that the quote above comes from the same Pope that condemned those who falsely call themselves defenders of the Church whilst attacking the ministers of the Church is incredibly ironic. I rely a lot on Pope St. Pius X. Some of the things that he goes into detail about regarding what it means to obey the Pope and how to identify fake Catholics goes so well with the SSPX being schismatic. And you get to see just how bad the position of the SSPX is when you see what these popes have said and how the SSPX are basically cherry picking what they say from these popes, whilst also rejecting what they say elsewhere that indirectly or directly condemns them in advance. Point 40. Cardinal Burke affirms the SSPX are in schism. Again, despite the various arguments surrounding the question, the fact of the matter is that the priestly society of St. Pius X is in schism since the late Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre ordained 4 bishops without the mandate of the Roman pontiff. They are no longer excommunicated, but they're also not in regular communion with the Catholic Church. And then I think Cardinal Muller earlier said that they still had a sacramental excommunication on them, which I'll go into detail in a minute. This article is an interesting one. I can't tell if it's from the same one as the earlier quote from Cardinal Burke, but since I've never seen them together in the same article, I'll treat them as separate. Anyway, in this interview, he absolutely rips apart the SSPX. The one part I will disagree with, though, which I know sounds ironically prideful of me, given the context, is that the Cardinal says they were in schism since the illicit ordination of their bishops. But from what I've seen in the writings of Pope St. Paul VI, they were in schism long before. Unless the Cardinal is talking about a formal condemnation of them being in schism. Regardless, he emphasizes that they are in schism due to their disobedience of the Pope. You don't have to have an official excommunication to be theologically schismatic. And continuing on from what I said before, the SSPX had 2 excommunications put upon them when they illicitly consecrated bishops. One was the canonical excommunication, as described in canon law, for illicitly consecrating bishops against the will of the Pope, and the second was the sacramental excommunication for violating divine law. Pope Benedict XVI removed the canonical excommunication from the SSPX, but the sacramental excommunication was still on them, because that cannot be removed until they return to full communion with the Church. So that's something else I do sort of disagree with about Cardinal Burke saying they're no longer excommunicated, unless he was, of course, specifically referring to the canonical excommunication. And I'm not making this up about the sacramental excommunication, as Cardinal Muller mentioned it earlier. Point 41. The SSPX had played the Vatican for years before they illicitly ordained 4 bishops, under the guise of trying to restore themselves to full communion. With great sorrow, the Church has taken note of the illegitimate episcopal ordination conferred last June the 30th by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, which has nullified all the efforts made over the years to ensure full communion with the Church for the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, founded by Archbishop Lefebvre himself. In fact, these efforts, especially intense in recent months, during which the Apostolic See has shown understanding to the limits of its possibilities, have been to no avail. And this is from Pope St. John Paul II in his document Ecclesia Dei. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this point is that there is no paragraph of analysis compared to this, which has the number and point, the quote, the source and link, and then a paragraph of analysis. This is because, as I described at the beginning of my video, when I was finding points to put into the overall list, I was going back and forth initially trying to make everything fit before I decided I would make it fit later on. And this is one of the later points I came across in my research by reading Ecclesia Dei. So you can expect to see more references from that document and quotes from that document be presented in my research. There's no paragraph of analysis yet, meaning that this had come after the point where I said I'll do the analysis later, but I was still trying to discern individual points from these documents. I brought forward this point because I wanted to draw a parallel between what the SSPX were doing back in 1988 and what they're doing now in 2026. It's the same game of pretending that they want to be in full communion with the Church and that they want to do everything they can to try and improve relations with Rome, but oh tragedy, they are forced into the position where, for their very survival, they have to illicitly consecrate bishops as their successors. It's the same playbook, and after the SSPX was suppressed in the mid-70s, there were multiple attempts where the Pope tried to bring them back into communion with the Church, up until 1988, where they announced that they would perform illicit consecrations, and so the Church went out of her way to try and bring them back into communion as fast as possible. There was sort of success where Lefebvre actually signed the agreement, but then the next day he went back on it, and the rest is really history there. But this is similar to what the SSPX have done more recently, where at the beginning of this year, or nearly the beginning of this year, at the beginning of February, they announced that they would perform illicit consecrations in the hopes that this would force Rome to act and come to the negotiating table. But Rome remained firm in what needed to be met, and the SSPX broke even faster than Lefebvre did, because Lefebvre did seem reluctant at first to illicitly consecrate bishops, but then voices like Williamson helped push him towards it. But it seems that the church has learned her lesson since then, and she won't be pulled around for months and kept in the dark about what the SSPX wants to do. So, in that regard, it's a good thing, especially since both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis went out of their way to try and bring them back into full communion with the Church, going further than Pope St. Paul VI and Pope St. John Paul II. But again, it was to no avail. The SSPX are always going to perform these illicit consecrations. It was only a matter of time, and I'm just glad that Rome is not beating around the bush with this. They're just being straightforward and saying, look, these are the conditions, you take them or leave them. We're not going to be waiting here for you to respond for months, trying to push us closer to a deadline that you're not even going to keep. As the series goes on, you'll notice that there will be more points like this with no paragraph of analysis, and it's not because I've not done my research, it's because I've not had the time to thoroughly analyze everything, and given just how widespread my research is, it means that any analysis I do when I finally finish compiling all the information I need will be very thorough. Point 42. The SSPX being given limited faculties for sacraments is canonically anomalous and not a sign they aren't in schism. Having said that, we, part of the kind of general confusion in the Church, has also entered into this question because the Holy Father has given the priests of the priestly society of St. Pius X faculties to celebrate validly marriages licitly and validly. But there is no canonical explanation for it, and it is simply an anomaly. When editing this point today, I received a comment on one of my YouTube videos by an SSPX apologist who tried to argue that the SSPX couldn't be in schism as no schismatic body had ever been granted faculties for the sacraments. This line from Cardinal Burke helps explain the glaring fault of this argument. There is no canonical explanation for it. Given that Pope Francis himself said that the SSPX were in schism and or not in full communion on at least 2 occasions, yet he gave them limited faculties, means that there must be an explanation for it. The SSPX can't say that the Pope lied about the references to them being in schism or not being in communion in the same document that granted them the faculties in the first place. That would undermine the faculties granted themselves. In which case, it must be accepted that there is an anomaly here, and that just because they have limited faculties doesn't mean they aren't in schism or are in full communion. So in the end, the SSPX can't use their limited faculties for the sacraments to help their case. Especially when you look at the reasoning Pope Francis gives for the conditional and unconditional sacraments of marriage and penance, respectively, for the SSPX. Pope Francis makes very clear that he's doing it for the sake of the people the laity who attend their services, not because the SSPX are in good theological standing with the Church, or they're in a viable theological position. So it's for the sake of the laity, not for the priests or the hierarchy of the SSPX. 43. Cardinal Burke says that the reception of the sacraments from the SSPX is not legitimate, nor is attending their services. And so it is not legitimate to attend Mass or to receive the sacraments in a church that's under the direction of the priestly society of St. Pius X. Cardinal Burke is a powerhouse in the Church. I recently had an argument with an SSPX apologist who claimed that Bishop Schneider said that the SSPX weren't in schism and the sacraments are fine to receive. He doubled down when I brought up Cardinal Burke and his stance. It soon became very apparent that the SSPX apologist was relying solely on Bishop Schneider for an argument from authority fallacy. Whereas whilst I could have done the same with Cardinal Burke, who as a cardinal has a higher authority than the bishop, I focused on his superior theological and canonical experience. His extensive familiarity with canon law and incredible history of services in the Church give reason to trust his statement more than a bishop from Kazakhstan who would have had very limited experience with the SSPX. I know I said recently here, or today, but keep in mind I wrote this over a year ago. I like to rely on Cardinal Burke because of his extensive experience in canon law and his consistent condemnation of the SSPX. If there's something I hate, it's when people try to argue from authority in favor of the SSPX, and they use characters like Bishop Strickland, Bishop Schneider, or even the now excommunicated sedevacantist Vigano. But when you compare that to someone like Cardinal Burke, you can't really argue from authority, since a cardinal has higher authority than a bishop. A cardinal bishop has a higher authority than a bishop or archbishop. And then, as I say here, Cardinal Burke's experience with canon law puts him in a far better position than most of the people trying to argue in favor of the SSPX. Point 44. The SSPX consider it a grave sin to receive Novus Ordo and Latin Mass sacraments. When it comes to attendance at the Novus Ordo Mass, SSPX priests do not hesitate to tell faithful that they should not attend that Mass under any circumstances, even on a Sunday, and in a place where no traditional mass is available. As mentioned before, SSPX priests advise going to a Novus Ordo Mass in all places and circumstances because it presents a grave danger to the faithful. It places one in the position of trying to honor God with a liturgy that dishonors him. If an SSPX priest is going to advise against attending a traditional Mass to fulfill the Sunday obligation, there must likewise be a grave danger to the faithful. Do I even need to begin telling you how bad this presents the SSPX? The SSPX not only hate the Novus Ordo liturgy, but even the celebration of the Latin Mass in the church that they aren't responsible for leading. And I know I'm breaking the paragraph of analysis here a bit, but it's very clear here that they're saying they don't just hate the Novus Ordo liturgy itself, they hate even the Latin Mass celebrated not by them. So it has to be celebrated by them for it to be valid and licit and not blasphemous or whatever. So it's clearly not just about the language of the liturgy or the specific form of the liturgy. This is a matter of pride for them. This is now a matter of them seeing themselves as the only priests that can legitimately celebrate the liturgy. So much so that they recommend staying away from all liturgies if there is no SSPX liturgy available, violating the Sunday obligation and holy days of obligation. The only way you could feasibly claim that this is possible without it being a sin is if it was a sin in itself to attend those liturgies. So even though the priest claims that there is only a grave danger, he's effectively treating it as a grave sin to attend a non-SSPX liturgy. Does that sound like someone who is in full communion with the church to you? There's not much more I can add to that analysis. So again, the SSPX is basically treating attendance of any liturgy in the Catholic Church, whether it be the Novus Ordo or even the Latin Mass celebrated in the Catholic Church, as being a grave danger, or if you remove all the subtleties, a grave sin. Point 45. The SSPX view the Novus Ordo Mass as heretical and intrinsically evil. Now, even if one wanted to contest the heretical elements of the new Mass, the sole refusal to profess Catholic dogmas quintessential to the Mass renders the new liturgy deficient. It is like a captain who refuses to provide his shipmen with a proper diet. They soon become sick with scurvy due, not so much to direct poison, as from vitamin deficiency. Such is the new Mass. At best, it provides a deficient spiritual diet to the faithful. The correct definition of evil, lack of a due good, clearly shows that the new Mass is evil in and of itself, regardless of the circumstances. It is not evil by positive profession of heresy. It is evil by lacking what Catholic dogma should profess, the true sacrifice, the real presence, the ministerial priesthood. This is of course all nonsense. Saint Bellarmine confirms the Pope cannot teach heresy or error, which would then corrupt the faith from the highest position in the Church. If Pope St. Paul VI approved of the Novus Ordo liturgy, then it cannot be heretical in the slightest. If the SSPX believe that it is truly deficient, then they should have gone to the Pope to tell him so that he could do something about it. Alternatively, there was no issue with it, and they were just trying to come up with a reason to discourage the laity from attending the Novus Ordo and receiving the sacraments. Just today, I argued with someone that claimed the SSPX has never called the Novus Ordo liturgy invalid. By giving her this reference, I showed her that they believe it to be both heretical and invalid by extension. It also looks like the SSPX do a good job of keeping some of their members in the dark about their own beliefs. And before anyone brings up the claim that something can be heretical and still valid, not in this case. The SSPX specifically accused the Novus Ordo liturgy of undermining the ministerial priesthood and true presence, which would make the liturgy invalid. When you're dealing with a group of people that have that sort of mindset, you realize that you're not going to be able to bring them back into communion with the church. And they definitely don't want to be back in communion with the church. And this is something that does bug me whenever it comes to attempts at reconciliation with the SSPX. Lefebvre himself said, and this I have to write about this, but Lefebvre himself said that he has no intention of returning back to communion with what he considered was a modernist and Protestant Rome, run by Freemasons and Antichrists. Fellay was in charge of the SSPX, I think back in 2012 or so, when they were trying to reconcile with Rome. And he said stuff like, oh, we accept 95% of Vatican II, we just want clarification on a few things and stuff. And there were people, I think specifically within the SSPX resistance, which is basically a splinter group of the SSPX, and they were saying that Fellay and the hierarchy of the SSPX were traitors for going against what Lefebvre had said. And Lefebvre was saying Vatican II is corrupt, it was influenced by Freemasonry and stuff, and then here you have Fellay saying that they actually agree with 95% of Vatican II. And then even more recently, when the SSPX, well, I think earlier this month, at least well, in February, because I'm not sure when I'm posting this, but back in February when the Vatican was trying to bring the SSPX back in line with the church before they illicitly consecrate bishops in July. What were you expecting? The SSPX do like to remove some of their articles and books that are quite controversial, depending on how they want to present themselves. But what were you expecting to get out of the SSPX when they consider the liturgy and the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, which is the center of our faith, mind you, the Eucharist? What were you expecting to get out of them if this is what they think of the center of the Church? You can't get anything good out of that. You can't build a bridge to someone when they believe something so fundamental to the faith in the Catholic Church is inherently corrupt, is heretical, and intrinsically evil. You just can't. So whilst I do understand the necessity of outwardly trying to show that you want to bring them back into communion with you, I don't think any of these reconciliation attempts were ever going to work, unfortunately. Point 46. The SSPX teach that the Novus Ordo liturgy is an offense to God. In fact, for those who have knowledge of its inherent problems, the new Mass is to be completely avoided, as they understand that it is an offense to God. The necessity of the Sunday obligation is so grave that it is a mortal sin to not attend Mass on Sunday without a good reason. I mentioned before that the SSPX openly discourages the laity from attending the Novus Ordo liturgy, not believing its sacraments are valid, even going so far as to claim it is heretical. To then say that it is an offense to God, tantamount to blasphemy, that too is erroneous. A liturgy approved by the Pope, who is prevented from teaching error to the faithful, cannot be heretical, sacrilegious, or blasphemous. We know this with certainty, so these accusations should be made clear to you from the mindset of the SSPX. They are no different to the heretics of the ages frothing at the mouth about the success of the Church and why they can't succeed in misleading the masses. Regardless of whether you believe the Pope could be a heretic or not, when you read essays by those like St. Bellarmine, he says in his different possibilities about whether the Pope could be a heretic or not, even when something like papal infallibility, there will never be a case where we will have to infallibly believe something heretical or dangerous to the faith. And the Pope cannot promulgate error for us to believe. And when it comes to something like the liturgy, that is encompassed by it. So the Pope can never approve a liturgy that would be spiritually damaging to the faithful. Point 47. The SSPX have a vastly different concept of what constitutes a valid consecration. The priest was mad at the bishop. He went into a bakery and he consecrates the whole bakery. Another one went into the cellar of the bishop and he consecrated all the wine. Well, it's sacrilegious, but it's valid.
The priest was mad at the bishop. He went into a bakery and he consecrated the whole bakery. Another one went into the cellar of the bishop and he consecrated all the wine. Well, it's sacrilegious, but it's valid. The bishop had to buy the whole bread, well, which was no longer bread, of this bakery. Of course, it's stupid, it's crazy, but it was valid. You see?
And that was by Fele when he was, I think, still the Superior General of the SSPX back in 2011. I went down a long and deep rabbit hole before finding this one by accident. Basically, Fele, the head of the SSPX, has a strange concept of what constitutes as a valid consecration of bread and wine. In this weird story of his, he then claims that the bishop would have had to buy all the bread and wine because it was now all the body and blood of Christ. The SSPX later realized that this was wrong and wrote an article meant to claim that Fele was not saying it was literally a valid consecration, but they have since deleted the article. And also they've hidden the video. You can only find this on the Wayback Machine, or the Wayback Archive, hence, as you can see by the link, which is web.archive.org. Take that for what you will. Actual Catholic teaching, however, says that the consecration can only be done by a validly ordained clergyman in the context of the Mass. This is why Satanists steal the Eucharist from churches instead of trying to consecrate the bread during the Black Masses. The SSPX like to claim that the Catholic Church isn't properly catechized, which leads to errors and heresy, but if one of their leaders didn't even know under what circumstances the consecration took place, what does that say about the quality of catechesis in the SSPX? Something I will say is that I get a lot of the research I do is original, so I look out for things myself, but I also get a lot of links and quotes and things from people who know I'm doing my research and they give it to me so then I can I can include it in my overall work. And this I think this video was one of the original video. It was the link of it was given to me by someone who was familiar with the SSPX. So thank you to everyone who does give me links and references and other stuff, showing your own research to the SSPX and giving it to me so I can include it in my compilation. Point 48. The SSPX compares a Novus Ordo liturgy to a satanic black mass. Traditionalist priests should not be forced to celebrate the Novus Ordo. Disliking the Novus Ordo, or even hating it, does not mean rejecting its validity. All that's needed for validity is matter, form, words of consecration, and intention. Even a black mass can be perfectly valid. That doesn't mean priests should be forced to celebrate them. This was a ridiculously tough point to find. See, I found one guy on Reddit who said that there was a sermon by Fele, head of the SSPX at the time. I think he was still the head of the SSPX in 2012, who made this comparison. But the link he provided unfortunately proves the SSPX had deleted yet another incriminating video or article of theirs. I spoke to the Redditor and he confirmed that although deleted, Fele had essentially repeated the same comparison that unofficial SSPX writers and members used between the Novus Ordo and a Black Mass. This is an incredibly disgusting comparison to make. It is already completely wrong. There is no such thing as a valid Black Mass. It is a mockery of the Catholic Mass where the Eucharist is desecrated. The consecration can only be performed during the context of the Mass by a validly ordained clergyman. Since there are no validly ordained clergymen at a Black Mass, how can it be valid? Putting that aside, let's focus on the comparison of the Novus Ordo to the Black Mass. The SSPX earlier said that the Novus Ordo was an offense to God and heretical, but now is comparable to a Black Mass? Again, that should give you an indication of the mindset of the SSPX. They are willing to believe in perverse theologies just so they can reject the form of the liturgy that they don't like, inevitably resulting in this abhorrent view of the Novus Ordo liturgy. Like I said, this was a bit of a rabbit hole to try and find, and I had to go onto Reddit for this. It says a lot that the SSPX would be drawing this comparison to a Black Mass. I mean, they've already said that it's blasphemous. They said it's an offense to God. They said that it's worth violating the Sunday obligation to not go to it. They said it's not valid, or the sacraments in it are not valid. And so, just going to step up and saying that it's comparable to a Black Mass says plenty about them. Not just in terms of their erroneous theology, but also their hatred. God is love. God is all about love. He is love itself. And I'm not saying that he's the embodiment of love, no. God is love, and everything he does for us is out of love for us. But when I look at the SSPX and the things that they like to say about the Catholic Church, there is so much hate that they have against us. And that hate alone would prove to me that they are not from God. Truly. I mean, even with Protestants, like, I know a lot of Protestants are also motivated by hate, but some of them say stuff like, well, we believe Catholics are wrong and we pray that they we pray that they come to the light or come to understand the error of their ways. But at least they're loving in that regard. At least they want what's best for us. With the SSPX, even their founder and their superior and their leaders to this day, even writers and the people who put up these videos, I mean, this stuff is put up there in the first place. This was intended to be seen by other people. The amount of hate that they have for us, despite apparently being in communion, as they claim, is absolutely abhorrent. So, like I said before, just as how previous reconciliation efforts with the SSPX were doomed to fail, you have people with this sort of mindset, and I guarantee you that, as you can see, this was said in like 2012, right? You will probably find that this was removed shortly after this claim was originally made. At least I think this was originally from 2012. You'll find that this was probably deleted shortly after it was made, when Fele was trying to have the reconciliation efforts with Rome around that time, and he wanted to present the SSPX as being an obedient son of Rome. And so, similar to how Lefebvre would perform purges of his clergy, and specifically Sedevacantist priests, when he was trying to get back in communion with Rome in the late 80s, just before his illicit consecrations. The SSPX were probably trying to suppress information like this, and yeah, they were probably trying to just suppress information like this to present themselves as being more obedient and not as promoting hatred towards Rome. Or this may have just been removed more recently, I guess, just by the SSPX, perhaps, because I'm not sure when they would necessarily remove this. I know it says this was written in the year 2012. Perhaps this was removed even more recently because the SSPX had been planning on illicitly consecrating bishops at least a couple years ago. So perhaps this was already removed a couple years ago in preparation for asking Rome's permission for new bishops. But that is essentially the next 24 reasons as to how we know the SSPX are in schism. And I know this video may seem a bit all over the place and stuff. I apologize for that. The first 24 points I had time to like put them together in a certain way and organize them, make them look good, and not have to worry about misspelling or wording things weirdly on Facebook. I haven't had the privilege of being able to do that same treatment and quality control for the bulk of my investigation, though, because it's still ongoing. So I do apologize for weird spellings and mispronouncing of things. I apologize for that, but as we've seen, there is a consistent behavior of the SSPX where they try to twist around Catholic theology to favor themselves. They openly attack the Novus Ordo liturgy, not just as being an offense to God and blasphemous and sacrilegious and so on, but literally comparing it to a black mass. Their understanding of the consecration is very weird, and they like to retract articles and videos that the web archive has managed to save a few of them, which demonstrate that the content that they've retracted is usually quite suspicious in terms of their theology or the things that they say about Rome. We've had statements from popes and people that knew those popes and were familiar with them, or even advisors to them, saying that the SSPX were definitely in schism. And even what the Dicastery for Legislative Texts has said, that the SSPX had a schismatic mindset long before the illicit consecrations in 1988, which were just the final straw that broke the camel's back. But it was the culmination of a series of schismatic behaviors. So, like I said, that's the next 24 points. I'll have another 24 points ready. I'm going to try and see if I can just record a bunch of these videos one after the other, because I've got a bunch of free time today. But yeah, hopefully by the time I record the next video, I'll be a bit more organized. And that's otherwise pretty much it for this video. I'm sure I'll have a bunch of people and SSPX defenders in the comments trying to say, no, you're wrong, and then they'll use some erroneous reasoning. But I assure you, just as how I said in my first video, that you need to watch everything I say to the end, so that you don't bring up anything you don't watch it halfway through and then put forward a bunch of arguments that I cover later on in that video. Do be careful about commenting under this video with your arguments, because with my experience with the SSPX, I know what sort of arguments will be brought forward against me. And I cover some of those arguments in later videos. So I've already got sort of scripts, or at least lists of points that I'm going to cover in my next videos. So if anyone who comes forward in my comments and brings forward the case of St. Athanasius, I'm covering that in either the next video or the video after that one. So you need to be patient when you bring forward your arguments about the SSPX, because there's a decent chance that I've already covered it. I've just not shared it yet, because of how long these videos will be. I mean, right now, I'm going to have to edit this video down to size, but this video is almost 2 hours, like 1 3/4 of an hour long. So I'm going to edit it down to size, to whatever length. I'm not sure how long the video will be when I finish editing it, but it may seem quite long to just watch all of these videos before you put forward before you put forward arguments. But I assure you, it's worth waiting for me to present everything. And even if I had stopped this series when I finally finished compiling my data and put forward everything in a more organized manner, and then I basically reboot the series, it'll be worth waiting so that you don't put forward an argument that hasn't already been countered, because then that reflects poorly on your behalf, since it seems like you're not a proper scholar in having already seen if there were any counter arguments to whatever it is you're going to try and present. Similar to how when Protestants put forward the exact same arguments that they've been doing for hundreds of years, and you look at it and you say, we've refuted this 50 times in the last 200 years, and that's not even including all the stuff that came before it. How can you not have known what we actually believe at this point? So, yeah. But otherwise, that's it for this video. I'm going to end it here before it gets too long. Thank you all for watching. God bless you all. See you in the next video, comrades. Until then.